Hello, and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. When you're ready to build your next pipeline or want to test out the project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends at Linode. With 200 gigabit private networking, scalable shared block storage, and a 40 gigabit public network, you've got everything you need to run a fast, reliable, and bulletproof data platform. And if you need global distribution, they've got that covered too, with worldwide data centers, including new ones in Toronto and Mumbai. And for your machine learning workloads, they just announced dedicated CPU instances to ensure that you get the performance that you need. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Linode, that's Linode today to get a $20 credit and launch a new server in under a minute. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of the show. And managing and auditing access to all of those servers and databases that you're running is a problem that grows in difficulty alongside the growth of your teams. If you're tired of wasting your time cobbling together scripts and workarounds to give your developers, data scientists, and managers the permissions that they need, then it's time to talk to our friends at StrongDM. They have built an easy-to-use platform that lets you leverage your company's single sign-on for your data. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/strongdm today to find out how you can simplify your systems. And Alluxio is an open-source, distributed data orchestration layer that makes it easier to scale your compute and your storage independently. By transparently pulling data from underlying silos, Alluxio unlocks the value of your data and allows for modern, computation-intensive workloads to become truly elastic and flexible for the cloud. With Alluxio, companies like Barclays, JD.com, Tencent, and 2 Sigma can manage data efficiently, accelerate business analytics, and ease the adoption of any cloud. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Alluxio today to learn more and thank them for their support. And you listen to this show to learn and stay up to date with what's happening in databases, streaming platforms, big data, and everything else you need to know about modern data management. For even more opportunities to meet, listen, and learn from your peers, you don't want to miss out on this year's conference season. We have partnered with organizations such as O'Reilly Media, Dataversity, and the Open Data Science Conference. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/conferences to learn more and take advantage of our partner discounts when you register. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers. Your host is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Eugene Khazin about the leading causes for failure in analytics projects. So, Eugene, could you start by introducing yourself?
Sure. So I am currently a partner in a technology consulting firm called PrimeTSR. Started it about 6 years ago with my partner Josh Davidson, but going all the way back to 1998, I started out as a database developer, cranking out reports for a marketing firm. Then I became a database administrator and eventually moved into data architecture. I tended to work all over the place in terms of types of companies where I kind of worked with. Worked with some large, big brand companies like Motorola, for example, and then worked with some tiny startups. But the unifying thing about all those companies that I was lucky enough to work with were that they were dealing with large, for the time of, let's say back in 15 years ago, 4 gigabytes was a large data set. And, I got lucky to work with all these large data sets. And so fast forwarding to 12 years ago, I see this as a general gap in the marketplace. I noticed that working with data at scale was hard for companies. They struggled with it. And so I started my first consulting firm. I became a consultant myself, helping clients deal with their data at scale, with their data platforms, processing the data, managing it, and just general data engineering type of activities. And so today, PrimeTSR has a large focus on that, on the analytics, on data engineering, and it all kind of grounds back to my passion for building scalable data platforms.
And so, as I mentioned at the open, we're talking about sort of the overall scope of failure in analytics projects, but because of the prevalence of analytics and business intelligence and machine learning these days, the term analytics itself has grown to mean so many different things to so many different people. So I'm wondering if you can just start by providing the definition that you tend to use and just how you want to sort of frame the idea of what an analytics project encompasses for the purpose of this discussion.
Yeah, being a consultant, we tend to see all sorts of ways, what people call analytics, starting all the way back to traditional descriptive, just operational reporting type of workloads, and progressing to decision support systems, and then getting to more advanced predictive and AI. I think all of these, in my opinion, have a right to call themselves analytics, but it's really about taking a pragmatic look at the maturity of your organization and deciding where on that scale what you should be doing. And there are two measuring questions that I would say any business person or any company that's trying to get into analytics should ask yourself is, do we as a company really have some good use cases for more advanced analytics, or should we still be focusing on descriptive stuff? And second question is, even if we did come up with good analytical use cases, do we really have the ability to get all the data that we need to satisfy those use cases? And, this isn't necessarily a technology problem, but many companies I see struggle with these concepts, trying to bite too much.
And the other sort of open question is how you define failure in the context of these projects, because different people might have different ideas of what constitutes success or failure at the outset. And also that definition may change over time as they're progressing through building and releasing the project or trying to maintain it once it's been launched to production.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. It depends, like if you're a glass half full or half empty kind of person. It's all really about the outcomes. And I think one of the criteria for kind of judging a success or failure, the best way to do this is if you come up with kind of objective measures. How would you measure your success or failure? And I'll give you an example. As part of our methodology as PrimeTSR, when we go execute a project with a client, before we even get started, before any paperwork gets signed, we sit down with a client and we ask them to think about concrete, like numeric success criteria that could be used to measure that success or failure. And it's, for instance, I was just with a client that's a large hospital, and we talked about how they want to introduce analytics into reducing the amount of ER visits to their ER. And so I asked, okay, so how do you measure the success of that project? The answer was, well, we can apply analytics. It will reduce the visits, and that's how we're going to measure. And it took some probing and kind of prodding to come up with, okay, the real goal is within a year after introducing the project, we want to reduce our ER visits by 7%. And that 7% is, in my opinion, is critical because it kind of removes that subjectivity of was it successful, was it not? Because it's really hard otherwise. And it's not just analytics, but it's analytics especially because these are capital-intensive projects. They end up costing a lot of money to organizations, and that inevitably causes some emotions. These are typically what I call career-impacting projects, good or bad. It depends on your situation.
And it's worth pointing out, too, what you were talking about there as far as the hospital said, oh, we have this goal, but then when you start digging, they actually have a much more sort of concrete business outcome that they're trying to drive towards. And that's worth noting for people who do work in the consulting or freelance space, that you don't necessarily want to be an order taker. You want to be driving to providing actual value to your customers and figuring out what are the pain points that they're trying to alleviate, and not just take them at their word of saying we want this product, because you might deliver that product and then they're still not happy and they're still not going to get the outcome that they were hoping for. So making sure that you have that understanding ahead of time and have those measurable outcomes definitely helps to ensure that both sides are happy at the end of the project.
Absolutely. And these are, like I said, because they're career impacting projects, people get emotional, and that's not necessarily a good thing, especially when things are not going so well.
And so I was actually recently speaking with someone else who quoted a recent Gartner report stating that there's an estimated failure rate on the order of 80% for most analytics projects, whether that's business intelligence or big data. And I'm wondering if your experience has reflected that reality, and in particular, what you have found to be the leading causes of failure in the projects that you've worked on at PrimeTSR.
It's funny that you say this. I think, honestly, because we internally had that conversation recently as well. And I feel like 80% is really an understatement. The reality, though, is it's not like it's 90 or 70. It's a bit more nuanced. Where I see a lot of projects, kind of the cycle that they go through is they set off on a project, burn through the budget, and only accomplish 20 or 30% of what they were supposed to accomplish. So depending on how you look at it, you did demonstrate something out of the project. It just cost you a lot more than you expected. And so companies tend to, depending again on the glass half full or glass half empty type of perspective, some would still call it a success, while others would call it a complete failure. So in that viewpoint gets massaged depending on the executive that's looking at it. So we see people treating that differently for each company. But an interesting way to look at it is like, what would be the symptoms that are causing, these organizations to get there, to have those challenges? It's such a high rate, 80 or 90%. We can argue about that, but it's really nobody's questioning that it happens. It fails a lot. And in my experience, it's not necessarily always a super technical problem. So, on the technical side, the data, as we all know, as data engineers, data is hard to consume, right? For whatever number of reasons you got from, a wide variety of data sources. The data may not be clean, not well organized, not available continuously. You often get like a data dump, but then you struggle with feeding that data on a regular basis to really make what you're building valuable. So that's a technical piece. But there is also, you end up often in situations where you present something to your stakeholders and you start seeing questions like, oh, where did this data come from? It should be coming from a different data source. Or, we have data in multiple data sources and it's the same data set, but which one should we consider the source of truth? And so like addressing that up front, I think goes a long way to dealing, to preventing some of the problems. And then last on this topic, I think another common cause of failures that I see is that projects take on too much to tackle. They're just trying to kind of what I call boiling the ocean, where these analytical use cases sometimes are grandiose, but they would take years to do, and executives with budgets, they're also humans, and they lose patience. And so you want to chunk up your problem into manageable pieces so you can demonstrate progress continuously.
Yeah, it's definitely important for the sort of large scale projects where you're trying to, reinvent a business or reimagine some internal capabilities that, as you said, you deliver in bite-sized pieces where you can actually get some sort of feedback of, is this even moving us in the right direction, or am I totally off base with this? Because if you just, as you said, do the order taking of, this is what I want, okay, I'm going to go spend 6 months, a year, however long to build it, and then you deliver it, and then either the business opportunity has moved on or you're completely off base of how you're expecting the data to be, or the data sources have changed since you first began working on it. And then you have all of this expenditure and all of this capital tied up in this project, but there's no way to actually sort of gain any real value back out of it, and you ultimately need to scrap it. Whereas if you do it in pieces and then try to make it a sort of composable process and a composable product, then there's much more probability that you're going to end up with something that's either successful by the original sort of markers of success, or at least useful in some other context for some other team or some other purpose.
Exactly. Yeah, that's well put.
And so, as data engineers who are involved in providing a lot of the foundational layers for these analytics projects, what are some of the strategies that we can pursue to increase the overall success rate of the projects that we work on and ensure that they don't get bogged down in this sort of long tail of trying to get something delivered that doesn't end up fulfilling the original business needs?
Yeah, so piggybacking on what you said previously, right, about the not trying to boil the ocean, it's really important to find a small use case that you can go with, and you can really use that use case to incrementally find the right data elements that are necessary just for this use case. Use that as an opportunity to set up all the backend plumbing and all the processing needed to process that data. Once you have it working and you have something to demonstrate, you can claim your initial success, and it goes a long way. So that's one. The other, I think generally as data engineers, we're in the business, I tend to tell this to my teams, we're in the business of reducing the friction, of minimizing the friction of getting to the data, right? What can we do to make the data as consumable, as useful as possible? Because once you get it in that spot, there are far more use cases that popping up all over the place that want to get access to that data, that want to pitch in with budgets and try to leverage the analytics, which at the end, since we are all champions of analytics, it's good for everybody. It's good for the company. So summarizing, minimizing the friction of access to the data and finding the small use case to work through them and incrementally show value are the two main tactics to help data engineers increase the success of their projects.
And also, as data engineers, it's easy to get mired down in just trying to maintain the status quo and keep systems running in the day to day. But what are some ways that we can engage with the business earlier on in the projects to ensure that we're able to provide our insights and our sort of knowledge to what's possible or what we're capable of institutionally and organizationally, but also from a technical perspective, and maybe identify some ways that we can use existing infrastructure rather than having to embark on an entirely new project for providing some analytics capabilities.
Yeah, so as an engineer, you are already day to day, as you mentioned, working kind of and with the data. You know what it takes to access the data, what it takes to, in bigger organizations, that's the red tape process is often, like 50% of the effort. So understanding that process and explaining to the business of what it's going to take and the best kind of shortcuts or approaches to get to the data and massage it, process it, in making it consumable. I think goes a long way and shows a lot of value to the business because oftentimes I see this working with executives. There is a huge gap between a leader coming up with a grand strategic idea for another analytical use case or some dashboard. And then there are layers in between when it gets down to the engineer that's working with the data, with accessing it. The effort that it takes is often really hard to conceptualize. So as engineers, if we can expose this information to the upper levels, we are ourselves become much more useful to the organization and also just generally speeding up the projects or making them more realistic.
And in your experience of working with your clients and working with your teams to try and produce these successful projects, what have been some of the components or the aspects of the project that are either outside of your control or that your data engineers have difficulty with as far as maybe providing useful feedback or being able to just sort of understand the broader context of what's necessary, maybe any sort of like knowledge gaps or areas of improvement that people working in the data engineering space should be thinking about as they sort of progress within their careers and as the industry evolves?
So I think one of the, we slightly touched on that earlier about the data being trusted. So identifying this is almost like a data governance problem, not so much data engineering, but data engineers run into it every day. So, what data source is considered the source of truth for a specific element is a really hard problem to solve for many larger organizations. And so, as a data engineer, because you're working with this data every day, getting an understanding of who you need to talk to get access to the data, where this data is residing, trying to get everybody on the same page to establish that source of truth for a specific data element. I think it's key, and it's something that the engineers are uniquely positioned to do because again they work with this data every single day. And then second, I think again data availability is often beyond our control. You run into things like compliance, or you would like to when on its own you can run reports against a single data source and that's fine, but you come up with a more interesting analytical use case when you need to blend your data, and all of a sudden that presents some security problem or some compliance issue that you get flagged on. And so, kind of keeping your eyes open for these things, understanding what are the governance, what are the compliance requirements within the organization or your industry, also really helps identify red flags that may stop the project in its tracks, let's say 3 months after it gets started.
And in the event that there is a project that ultimately results in failure, what are some of the lessons that you can learn that you can fold into future work? And if you have any specific examples of work that you've done to provide some sort of broader context or specific examples, that might be useful as well.
Yeah, so I think regardless of whether your project is a success or failure, you tend to, as an engineer, you tend to spend a lot of time digging through the data, working with the sources, understanding your data. And so inevitably that feeds nicely into the next project. It helps position it and make the next project more successful. An example would be we recently completed a project for a large insurance company. Where as consultants we don't always come as much as we would love to. We don't come at the beginning of the project. We're often brought in when there are problems. And so we came in, and the project was about reducing the amount of fraud on insurance claims. So they wanted to run some analytics and some models, risk models against the data to be able to detect fraud. And the initial failure of the project was tied to the data being so poorly structured because it came from a mainframe. And so we took a fresh cut, but we were able to also absorb the team that worked on the initial project. And even though they spent a year working with this data, kind of banging their heads against the wall because mainframes are hard to deal with these days, they were really super valuable to us and to the success of the project at the end because they knew how to get to the mainframe. They knew how to pull the data out, and they learned the gotchas and all this kind of hidden things that come up that we would have never known if we started the project fresh like they did a while back. We brought in our additional skills of we were able to process the data faster and quicker than the skill set that they were lacking initially, but they had that subject matter expertise about the data from the initial unsuccessful attempt at the project, which really helped. So the bottom line, it's not a lost effort when you spend time digging through your data, understanding it, and trying different options to make it useful.
And that leads me into my next question about ways that you can salvage a project that is either on its way to failure or has failed, whether it's trying to sort of revive the original goal or be able to just extract some of the components or some of the work or knowledge that was gained in the effort to apply it to new projects or abstract it into something that is just broadly useful in the data industry, and any experiences that you've had along that lines.
Yeah, I think, as consultants, again, we often come in to these, what I like to refer as zombie projects. They're already dead, but they're still walking, and we get brought in to try to revive them. And so I think the trick is to be able to show some value in the shortest amount of time possible. So identify some small nugget of outcome that would really bring value to your project sponsors, and then I think, and this is a key, is not just find that outcome, but also quickly try to visualize it using whatever tool you prefer for visualization. But picture is worth 1,000 words, and when these executives they start seeing things on a dashboard, I've seen a lot of projects get additional runway just because they were able to demonstrate some sexy dashboards to that were still kind of valuable. They weren't a throwaway, but they shown the fruit of the labor that the engineers put in initially into the project and all that budget that went in there. And so they tend to revive that tends to revive the projects and get you a little bit more runway to show value. It's still a fire drill, but it helps.
And in your experience of working with these zombie projects, what have you found to be some of the common issues or common patterns, either architecturally or organizationally, that have led to these types of failures?
I would say the number one kind of warning, red flag for me is when I see a project. I often come in to do like project QAs. So my first question is usually, you've been going for 6 months. When was the last time that you did a demo to your stakeholders? And, sometimes people say, well, we do it fairly regularly. And other times it's like, well, we've spent 6 months working on the back end. There is nothing to show to the end users yet because it's all back end stuff. You're setting up the plumbing, getting the data in. And to me, this is a major red flag because, if your stakeholders go on without a demo, they start getting kind of antsy. Where is my budget going? What's happening? Right? They want to see the results continuously. So embracing this agile approach and demonstrating value quickly and visualizing it is one of those key things that you wanna do frequently in your project. And then the other one is paying attention to questions. Well, let's say you do a demo and like really keeping your eyes open for questions like, where is this data coming from? I thought it was supposed to come from another application. So when the users start questioning your data, you better have some good answers of where it's coming from, why one source is considered the source of truth versus the other. Because nothing kills a project faster than the lack of adoption. You can release the snazziest product ever with nice visualizations, but at the end, if your users don't trust the data that they want, and it's pretty hard to make them use something that they don't want to use. they'll go back to the old ways. So really focus on making sure you garner trust of your end users in the data that they see.
And so, in your experience of working with these different analytics projects and trying to build systems that are effective and productive, what are some of the common patterns or technical platforms that you have incorporated into your standard toolkit when engaging with these different clients?
Yeah, so depending on the use case, we tend to go either streaming or micro batching. In terms of the platforms, because we were born as a cloud company, we prefer technologies. We are a large proponent of Azure and Azure Data Factory. We've done some largest implementations using Azure Data Factory and Azure Data Warehouse, allowing us to scale some fairly impressive workloads and process them very fast. So, that example that I made earlier about extracting the data from the mainframe, the only way, for example, in that situation to scale and make the data available for analysis in the allowed time frame was to leverage the Azure Data Warehouse and scale out the compute quickly to process the data in less than an hour versus initially when they were trying to do this, it took them like 3 days to process. So big fans of the cloud technologies. Streaming or micro batching is kind of the standard patterns for us. And then we use some technology to process the data. Sometimes it's between anything between custom dev to often clients have application some that they invested in. For example, something like MuleSoft. We also happen to be a MuleSoft partner, so we have the skills and we tend to leverage that platform a lot.
And working as a consultant in the data engineering space, I'm wondering what you find to be any particular business challenges as far as identifying customers or raising awareness of the product offerings that you have and just engaging with them to help them to help educate them on the need for having this capability, and also whether you are engaged with working on training their in-house staff to be able to take over the projects once it's complete, and any challenges that you encounter in that overall process.
Yeah, so part of our engagement model is that we always want to work in hybrid teams because what you just referred to, the problem of consultants coming in, building something, and then leaving, and the teams on the ground, the client employees are sort of stranded. They don't know how to use a platform. It's super common. We hear about it. We come from big consultancies where a lot of times this is a common issue. So working as a hybrid team, when we come in and we work as part of our team, we always have some engineers from the client side. We have some of their business stakeholders that are able to explain how their business runs. Is critical to in my opinion, the success of the project. And the consulting engagements are always about concrete outcomes that you define well. But that's only part of it. The other is really trying to understand the client's business, and then when you introduce new tech, making sure that the people on the client side really understand that tech, that they're trained, that they can carry on and maintain the system and actually make enhancements to it in the future.
And are there any particular areas of knowledge or technical capability that you find are particularly difficult to train them up on, or areas that are sort of commonly lacking in the teams that you work with, as far as just it's not a concern that they've had to deal with, so they haven't really gained the technical aptitude in it?
So if I go broadly, I think cloud technologies and cloud native technologies are still a tough sort of thing to wrap for people to wrap their minds around. And we see that especially more established kind of brick and mortar organizations that still have their physical data centers and very much into big hardware. The staff that they have are often just don't know how to operate, don't know how to think about the cloud. So that's just a more broad context. And then digging in, we tend to, again, in the analytics space, we tend to see people focusing on large batches, large ETL, and that's also trying to switch them to micro batching and streaming is a hard concept to teach, right? A lot of times these people are, they're, let's take in the Microsoft world, they would be developing SSIS packages all their lives, and all of a sudden we are telling them that we are introducing a streaming architecture, and it's a completely different paradigm and a different skill set, and it's hard, no question about it. But this is a future, and if the leadership of these organization wants to achieve their goals that they set for the teams, they have to learn.
And what are some of the overall industry trends in analytics or data platform technologies or just sort of general business awareness of data as a first order concern that you are most excited about or keeping close track of?
Well, so I'll give you an example. I just came from a HIMSS conference, which is a large healthcare informatics conference in Orlando. It's something like 45,000 people. And the biggest topic that everybody wanted to talk about was, and this is a change, it hasn't been that way in the last few years, but this year the whole topic was about AI and advanced analytics and machine learning. And so that was the top header. And level below, people's concerns were, how do we get the right data? How do we get it prepped? So all the things that data engineering works on and addresses. And it's exciting to me because we are finally seeing the business to really starting to understand, see the value in these advanced concepts. And there are lots of good vendors that are kind of helping them understand that through tooling, but also probably a big part of why they're getting there is because the competition is pushing, kind of stepping on their toes. And also a lot of the low hanging fruit that they could achieve without applying analytics has been picked. And so now you have to go a level deeper. You have to apply analytics to squeeze additional margins, efficiencies, and just generally, in order to get ahead of your competition, you have to use analytics these days. And it's super exciting to me because that's my field.
And do you have any particular advice for data engineers in terms of resources or just general sort of research or knowledge acquisition that they can pursue to help them be more active and effective in the overall life cycle of an analytics project and to just help them stay up to date with current industry trends and ways that they can be architecting and building these types of systems?
I'll answer it in a less technically focused way. I think, so because engineers are really good about picking up additional skills and training related to the engineering, to the technical stuff. But I see this as a major gap, as a problem, is that engineers are sort of like heads down deep in solving technical problems without seeing the big picture of what is a project supposed to do? What business value is it supposed to derive for the organization? And so I think it's critical, and it helps people's careers. I see it often. Those engineers that take interest in actually kind of the big picture view of the project, into how it's impacting the business, how it's impacting their customers. Those engineers get a lot further in their careers than the ones that are sort of deep down just hacking away. Nothing wrong with that, but you need to tie what you're doing to business value.
And are there any other aspects of the work that you're doing at PrimeTSR or your experience of working with or rescuing these failed projects or zombie projects that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
I think, from as another aspect, the big hard thing that a lot of companies are just starting to scratch the surface on is non-structured data. And the majority of the data that they're still processing is coming from relational databases. But as AI and machine learning becomes more prevalent, these are very data hungry algorithms, and the data that's needed is often unstructured. And so I feel like we are just starting to scratch the surface, but we are getting in there. And we see a lot of value in being able to deal with unstructured data. And eventually, also things like voice and image processing because is going to become the hot topics and bring value to the organization to pushing the analytics use case further and further.
And for anybody who wants to get in touch with you or follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as a final question, I'd like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
Yeah, this, I just mentioned the voice and image processing. I think the tooling there is still not where it needs to be to really process it. We are seeing some advances in NLP, but it's definitely not where it needs to be, in my opinion. But I'm confident that it will catch up over the next few years. Everyone has Amazon Alexa in their house nowadays, and I'm sure Amazon will try to leverage that voice data and build some products to somehow harvest it. And so this will be the trigger, and then the adoption will come into play in a couple years.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to share your experience of working with these projects in various states of failure or success. It's definitely useful to get that broad perspective, so I appreciate that, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Tobias. Have a good day as well.